Okay, we're back. So apparently I'm a bit of a liar. During the break, I went and I took a look at the original, and what I was going to do, what I talked about at the end of the last video with the emissive here for that color animation, is actually indeed based off of these guys. So it's going to be super easy to do. So what I want to take care of first is getting this water sorted out. And one of the things that I noticed is that when we were finishing up the last video, that the water wasn't looking like I had had it looking at the same stage when I had done this the first time around. So I took a little bit of time and I tried to figure out why. And the reason was, well, we forgot to do a couple of settings here, but that's minor. The reason was, well, there's two main reasons. First of all, this blur here, which I really like because it gives it an extra smoothness, which is good for water. Um, Actually, if you think about it, it widens out the image really. So some of the timings that I had for my original noises here no longer really applied. So I adjusted those. The other big thing is that I originally said, I remember that it didn't matter which one of these was on the top and which one of these was on the bottom. Well, I was wrong. And fluid should in fact, this one here should in fact be on top and the other one should be underneath. Uh, then while I was doing it, we're also going to add another node that we haven't discussed up in here, which we'll talk about later. And then the other thing that we're going to do, I decided that uh, this map here for the roll, for the height map, should be more contrasty because right now it's a pretty, there aren't really any, it's not, it's relatively shallow. The height information isn't as deep as I'd like it to be. And by making this more contrasty and making the height information deeper, it will allow us to have more flexibility in the engine itself to adjust the height of that roll using our shader. So that's also, all of these are really quick fixes. So let's start at the beginning. And so we'll do this now. We'll do this in one video, and then we'll do the color in the last one, and that'll be a quickie. So let's start back here and make sure that these settings are the way I want it to be. Now the biggest culprit here is fluid. What I had forgotten to do was that in my original, I forget where else I did this, but I put a time slider on disorder, straight up, just time, $ time. The warp intensity I had set at 19.31. Now what this is doing now is changing the shape of the actual thingies in here. And you're more than welcome to put, this one isn't really worth putting because I don't think it makes that much of an appreciable difference as far as like movements of waves, but you can do, what are we at, 19.31. But pattern length, again, you can, it changes the dimension of those actual fluid molecules, if you will. This I had pattern length, I think it was at whatever it was before. I don't even have it marked down here, but the pattern width, oh, pattern length that is 0.4. Okay. So these are kind of chubbier. It works a little bit better. And then for cells, these guys are a little too big. We had them a bit smaller. Okay. So, and again, this distance is something you could animate this, and the sky's the limit. So, you're learning basic concepts, and these are all things you can apply. Before we deal with what's going on in here, let's switch these around. So, like I said, I got it exactly backwards. So we want fluid to be the one on top, and we want cells to be the one on the bottom. So we're going to switch these around so we can graphically see what we're doing. And then we're also going to take this grayscale converter and we're going to move it up here because this grayscale converter belongs to whatever that top one is. So now we just move this to the top, we move this to the bottom, and then we switch this out. Right, so this one's done. Now this has messed things up for us down here. So again, we're going to do the same thing. We want our, well, no, we're going to do this. We want our cells on the bottom, and we want the fluid on top. Right. So this is now in the correct order. The other thing that I wanted to change is I want to move this up to 20 in order to match this, because we want both these guys at the same intensity, because we're trying to blend them, and we don't want we're trying to avoid having one stomp all over the other. While I was doing this, I ended up using this blur, but while I was doing this, I took a look at another node that I also use quite, not as often as the blur, but for normals there's a thing called normal blend. Now this is specifically designed for normal maps, and so you've got a normal foreground, normal background, and then mask. It won't give you, it just has opacity. It doesn't give you blend modes, and it's only for normals, and sometimes it's the better thing to use. However, it's more computationally, it's more expensive. So I find myself to be using the blend mode probably 8 times out of 10 when I'm dealing with normal. Sometimes this works better and it's worth the extra computational time, but in my experience anyway, often that's not the case. So I'll usually end up going with the blend node, but what I'll do, and what I'm going to do here, is instead of having it copy, I'm going to have it as an overlay, which is going to overlay this one on top of the other, so you can kind of see the lower one through it. And then the other thing we're going to do to sort of even accentuate, to give it even more sort of even-handedness in the way these things are relating to each other, is we're going to add a level here, which is, we don't want it on this one. We're going to replace that like that. This levels will only be for the mask that we're going to put on here. Because remember, what we're trying to do with this is we've got two things swinging in each on an arc, and they're doing it in slightly different directions at slightly different speeds. We're trying to sort of kill that swing. Now, because we know we've got one kind of going crosswise against the other at more or less a 90-degree angle, that the closer we get that to sort of like a pure 50-50 split, that will sort of give the least effect of anything swinging in any one direction too much. So this is kind of, there aren't any real true blacks in here, and I'd like to see more of that. So I'm going to get to something that I feel will be sort of give me a 50-50 split between the two of them. So something probably like this. And then I'm going to use this. Let's see what happens to this as we do this. I'm going to use this as the mask. So again, it's showing a lot more of the one that's underneath. So I don't want this one to, the one on top tends to overwhelm the other one unless you take care to make sure that it's as blended as well as you can. So I think that will do us as far as the blend goes. And then this is going on top of here. And then another thing, while we're here, we might as well add it, because one of the things that I forgot to put in that I did have in the original, which I kind of liked, was a way to make the ripples sort of what I called ripple height. But the only thing I'll actually be doing is I will be moving this opacity. I'm going to create an input parameter for this opacity, and we're just going to move this up and down, and this will allow the end user to sort of have that normal be stronger or lighter, and that gives that effect. So, oops, what am I don't know what I did there. Oh, because I have another one called water that I have closed, so I'm going to close that. All right. Where was I before I distracted myself? So, oh yes, I'm about to make a new input parameter. So we're going to call this ripple strength, and this will be strength in the group ripples. And the default we'll have is 1, and we'll let people lower it down if they like. You know, actually, I don't want them to go down to nothing at all. So I'm going to set a floor for this one. Let's call it 0.1, right? And so the minimum amount will be 0.1 and the maximum amount will be 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp it. And this will prevent people from going beyond those parameters. So let's get rid of this. I'm just showing that. And so that's that done. Now let's get to this bit. Because one of the things, one of the problems that I had with this was that they're big. Okay, these sort of what I'm calling ripples aren't really ripples. They're kind of these big blobby things, and I want them to look more like ripples. So, you know, a lot of that was a function of blurring it out, which I think is a great thing. I'm really happy I stumbled into that one. But I want to sort of tighten them up a little bit. Now, there's this other awesome node called Noise Upscale. And I mean, they make it sound super fancy. Allows to increase the resolution of a noise without a too much visible tiling effect. Basically, it's tiling your noise. And I'm just copying a new one to put down here because we're going to do the exact same thing to either one of them. But you'll also notice that it bumps up the resolution by 1. Now, there's 2 ways of doing this. You can just go here and you can lower it down, but you know, here. But the better way of doing it is actually going from an optimization point of view, you try to get as far back to the root as you can. So we're going to leave these at 0, and we're going to actually bring this to -1. Oop. Trying to do both sides. And that's more efficient. And it achieves the exact same thing. So these are now smaller. And we have one thing left to do on my list of things to do. And that is, whoops, we've gone too far, is making this guy more contrasty so that we can have some more flexibility in the shader with how big we can get that roll. So again, I'm going to make a levels for this one, and I'm just going to adjust those so that I got a bit less gray and a bit more black and white. If I can make that happen, that'd be great. I mean, I don't want it too much, but I'm trying to create some depth here. I'm trying to make it more of a roll, because right now, I mean, this is fine the way it is for the way we have it set up. But if we want to have sort of a you know, more rolly ocean, this limits us with what we can do within the shader. So we're going to apply this to our height map. Right. I think that's it. Let's take a look and see what's going on with that. Oh, you know what? That looks kind of opaque. Because we messed around with stuff in here. I'm just gonna, oops, we had that set up as a variable. So I'm gonna go into here, water opacity. Let's set the default a little bit lower than that. Yeah, it's still pretty opaque, but right. So let's publish this out and see what we come up with. Yeah, all right. You see how those guys are a lot smaller now. We can get it to play. And we can now start to adjust. Okay, give this a little bit more movement. Probably a bit too much. And maybe a bit more frequency, and maybe blur it a little, I don't know, a little bit more, a little bit less. You know, this is where you can start to, you know, get it exactly how you want. And if you're not happy with these things and you want, you know, if you think your problem of not getting it how you want lies in something other than these variables, and you can always go back to your original, kind of figure out what it is. You know, maybe up here in the pixel, in one of these pixel processors, you want to change some of these things around, but you're not sure. You can, you know, what I do is I make a, you know, a temporary variable out in the main, that kind of drives me crazy, out in this main thing, main graph, and then I'll leave this number, you know, I'll leave the constant right here. You just make a new variable, and, you know, you plug it in temporarily and you play with it in your engine, and once you figure that out, you can just come back in here and replace that constant with whatever it was you wanted to change. But, you know, I don't think there's any point in going and adjusting the water any more than we have here, because, you know, that's something that you're going to do to your own taste. And I think we've got enough of the concepts down now that that you don't really need to do that. That being said, I think I want to. But the other thing I wanted to show you was that you can also now, because we kind of bumped up that height map, we can now also come in here, and it gives us leeway to get some more, you know, wave action happening here, and maybe, you know, it looks like deeper water, so we'll ump the opacity up a little bit, and, you know, all of a sudden it's much more of an oceany look to it than it was before. And again, I think those guys could probably be a bit smaller. So again, you can daisy chain these. Oh, come on, you can daisy chain these guys. So we can go ahead and see what happens if we do that. Let's. Oh, it's probably easier this way. So I'm going to bring a couple of these guys out. I don't want it to increase anything because this is already set at 256. So I'm just going to automatically just put these at -1, because we're dealing with, remember, we're dealing relative to parent. So because this graph, all these nodes are relative to parent, you're just setting that relationship. I don't know if this is going to work. I've never tried it, but we'll find out. So see what happens when we do that. But you know, this is the part of it where you're really kind of going off on your own and deciding what you want your individual thing to look like. Yeah, so that made it yeah, it set all those things back, but you know, again, but each time you change that size, you know, all of these things need to get adjusted according, which is why it kind of gets, you know, very persnickety. But you can see that, you know, with this basic water setup here, you now have, you've got a lot of tools, because don't forget, you can also get trickier with, you know, right now all we have them doing is basically moving in one direction that they were set up. But, you know, there's no law that says you can't put a rotate in there either. So there, just with this kind of setup, you've got a lot of leeway of customizing that water the way you want it, because there are so many points at which you can make adjustments, and you can, you know, once you understand that everything's basically moving in an arc, and as long as you keep things moving more or less on the same arc, and that's why we're, you know, we've got, it's a pretty limited number. We've got, you know, a limited number of pixel processors here, and we're kind of basing everything off of that, which brings me to what we're going to be doing in the last video, which is not going to be related to any of this height information, but again, we're going to use the same principle with these guys, where we're going to take something and we're going to make a color animation, but again, it's part of the same body of water, right? So it's moving kind of in the same rhythm, or based off of the same rhythm that the water is. So we'll leave it here for now, and we will come back for the final video where we're going to take a look at doing some more color animation here to kind of give it the sort of final je ne sais quoi.